In 2024, Russia earned approximately $63 to $70 billion from natural gas exports globally, a figure that actually exceeds or approaches the roughly $60–65 billion Russia earned annually from gas exports in the years immediately preceding the Ukraine invasion, when Europe was still Russia's primary customer, not despite European sanctions, not by barely surviving sanctions through desperate measures, but by completely restructuring global gas export strategy toward Asia in ways that replaced European revenues almost entirely within just 3 years. Let me explain what actually happened with real numbers, because the story that sanctions crushed Russian gas revenues is fundamentally false. In 2021, Russia exported approximately 210 billion cubic meters of pipeline gas globally, roughly 155 billion cubic meters to Europe and 55 billion cubic meters to other destinations, primarily China. Additionally, Russia exported approximately 30–35 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas, LNG, globally. Total gas exports were roughly 245 billion cubic meters in 2021. At 2021 prices averaging roughly $250–300 per thousand cubic meters for European pipeline gas and similar prices for LNG, Russia's total gas export revenue in 2021 was approximately $60–70 billion. This represented major source of Russian government revenue and foreign exchange earnings. European sanctions throughout 2022–2023 targeted this revenue stream. Europe throughout 2022–2023 reduced Russian pipeline gas imports by approximately 90%, from 155 billion cubic meters annually to roughly 15–20 billion cubic meters by 2024–2025. This was supposed to cripple Russian gas revenues and force Russian government to choose between losing revenues or ending Ukraine war. But throughout 2022–2025, several things happened that European sanctions planners didn't anticipate. First, European gas prices throughout 2022–2023 spiked dramatically due to lost Russian supply. Prices that averaged $250–300 per thousand cubic meters in 2021 reached $1,500 per thousand cubic meters at peaks in 2022. Even in 2023–2024, as markets stabilized, European gas prices remained elevated at $400–600 per thousand cubic meters. Russia, throughout 2022–2023, continued selling the reduced volumes to Europe at these massively elevated prices, selling 40–50 billion cubic meters in 2022–2023 at $200 per thousand cubic meters, generated similar or higher revenue than selling 155 billion cubic meters at $250–300 per thousand cubic meters in 2021. Russia made as much or more money from much less gas because prices spiked so dramatically. Second, Russia throughout 2022–2025 massively increased gas sales to China. Power of Siberia pipeline, completed in December 2019, ramped up throughout 2020–2024 to design capacity of approximately 38 billion cubic meters annually by 2024. Additionally, Russia throughout 2022–2025 redirected LNG exports from Europe to Asia, with Chinese purchases of Russian LNG increasing substantially. By 2024–2025, Russian gas exports to China have reached approximately 50–60 billion cubic meters annually through combination of Power of Siberia pipeline and LNG. This is roughly 1/3 of what Russia used to sell to Europe, but its enormous increase from essentially zero in 2018. Third, Russian LNG exports throughout 2022–2025 have continued at near pre-war levels. Russia's LNG production capacity is approximately 30–35 billion cubic meters annually from facilities including Yamal LNG and Sakhalin-2. This LNG throughout 2022–2025 has been redirected from European customers to Asian customers, particularly China, India, and other Asian markets. European sanctions throughout 2022–2025 did not effectively target Russian LNG despite targeting pipeline gas. European countries, including France, Spain, and Belgium, throughout 2022–2025 have continued importing Russian LNG even while claiming to reduce Russian gas dependence. This inconsistency allowed Russia to maintain substantial LNG revenue throughout the sanctions period. Adding up the numbers for 2024, Russia sells approximately 20 billion cubic meters of pipeline gas to Europe at elevated prices around $500 per thousand cubic meters, generating approximately $7 to $10 billion. Russia sells approximately 50 to 60 billion cubic meters to China through pipeline and LNG at prices around $450 per thousand cubic meters, generating approximately 25 billion. Russia sells approximately 35 billion cubic meters of LNG to various Asian and European customers at prices around $500 to $600 per thousand cubic meters, generating approximately 15 to $20 billion. Russia continues selling approximately 50 billion cubic meters to other customers, including Turkey, Central Asia, and others, generating approximately 15 to 20 billion. Total 2024 Russian gas revenues approximately $70 billion compared to 2021 revenues of $70 billion. Despite Europe reducing imports by 90%, total Russian gas revenues in 2024 approximately match or slightly exceed pre-war levels. Now let me explain when and how Europe quietly admitted its sanctions plan failed. There was no single dramatic announcement. But throughout 2024 and into 2025, multiple European officials' reports and policy shifts have revealed implicit acknowledgement that gas sanctions didn't achieve intended objectives. In mid-2024, European Commission internal assessments that were partially leaked to media showed that Russian gas revenues had not collapsed as anticipated. Reports indicated that Russian gas revenues throughout 2023-2024 were recovering toward pre-war levels through combination of redirected exports and elevated prices. European media throughout 2024 began publishing analyses showing that while Europe successfully reduced Russian gas imports, Russia successfully replaced European revenues through Asian markets. This represented shift from triumphalist early 2022-2023 narratives claiming sanctions were crippling Russia. In late 2024, several European officials gave speeches or interviews where they acknowledged that energy sanctions inflicted costs on Russia but didn't prevent Russia from sustaining war effort through energy revenues. The language shifted from sanctions are working to stop Russian aggression to sanctions are part of long-term pressure that will eventually constrain Russia. European policy throughout late 2024 and 2025 has increasingly focused on preventing future Russian energy leverage rather than claiming current sanctions have eliminated Russian revenues. EU discussions throughout 2025 about completing energy independence from Russia implicitly acknowledge that Russia continues earning substantial energy revenues and will continue to do so indefinitely from Asian markets. The admission is implicit rather than explicit, but throughout 2024-2025, European rhetoric has clearly shifted from claiming sanctions are destroying Russian gas revenues to acknowledging that Russia has adapted and that Europe's main achievement is reducing its own dependence rather than eliminating Russian income. Subscribe to this channel if you want continued honest analysis of sanctions effectiveness rather than propaganda, claiming policies are working when evidence shows otherwise. Now let me show you what this means for European energy security and costs. Europe throughout 2022-2025 successfully reduced Russian gas dependence from 40% of supply to roughly 8-10%, which is genuine strategic achievement that reduces Russian leverage over Europe. But this achievement came at enormous economic cost. European gas prices throughout 2022-2025 have remained structurally higher than pre-war levels. Where European gas cost $250–300 per thousand cubic meters in 2021, throughout 2024-2025, it costs $400–600 per thousand cubic meters, even in relatively stable periods. This represents permanent increase in European energy costs because cheap Russian pipeline gas has been replaced with more expensive LNG and Norwegian pipeline gas. European households throughout 2022-2025 have paid hundreds of billions in additional energy costs compared to what they would have paid with continued Russian gas supplies. European governments throughout 2022-2024 spent approximately $500 billion in energy subsidies and relief programs to cushion consumers from price spikes. European industry throughout 2022-2025 has faced energy costs 2 to 3 times higher than pre-war levels, leading to permanent closure or relocation of energy-intensive industries, including chemicals, fertilizers, metals, and others. European industrial production throughout 2023-2024 was significantly below pre-war levels, partly due to high energy costs. These costs, hundreds of billions in higher consumer prices, hundreds of billions in government subsidies, permanent loss of industrial capacity, were theoretically justified by severely damaging Russian gas revenues and forcing Russia to end Ukraine war. But if Russian gas revenues throughout 2024 actually match pre-war levels, what did Europe's economic pain accomplish strategically? Europe reduced its own Russian dependence at enormous cost, which has strategic value for future. But Europe didn't reduce Russian revenues, which was the primary objective. This is what makes the admission painful. Europe paid huge costs but didn't achieve the main goal. Let me explain how Russia accomplished this revenue preservation despite losing 90% of European market. Geographic diversification throughout 2022-2025 has been crucial. Russia in 2021 was overwhelmingly dependent on European market for gas exports. Losing Europe in 2022 could have been catastrophic. But Russia throughout 2019-2025 had been building Power of Siberia pipeline to China, which completed just months before Ukraine war began. This providential timing gave Russia alternative customer for gas that would have gone to Europe. Russia throughout 2022-2025 also massively increased LNG exports to Asia. Russian LNG that used to go to Europe now goes to China, India, Japan, and other Asian markets. These markets throughout 2022-2025 have been willing buyers, particularly as they can purchase at discounts to global LNG prices. Price dynamics throughout 2022-2024 also helped Russia. When Europe stopped buying Russian gas, European prices spiked. This meant Russia earned more per unit for reduced European sales. And global gas prices throughout 2022-2024 remained elevated, meaning Russian exports to Asia also fetched good prices. By 2024-2025, global gas markets have partially normalized, but Russia throughout this period earned windfall revenues from elevated prices that compensated for reduced volumes in early post-sanctions period. Chinese demand throughout 2022-2025 has been a critical factor. China needs natural gas for power generation, heating, industrial uses, and environmental goals to reduce coal dependence. China throughout 2022-2025 has been willing to buy massively increased volumes from Russia at prices that work for both parties. China pays less than European spot prices, but more than Russian production costs, creating win-win for Russia-China gas trade. China throughout 2024-2025 is buying approximately 50-60 billion cubic meters annually from Russia, and this is expected to increase to 100+ billion cubic meters by early 2030s as Power of Siberia 2 is completed. Indian demand throughout 2022-2025 has also been significant. India throughout 2022-2025 has massively increased Russian LNG imports, becoming one of the largest buyers of Russian gas that used to go to Europe. India throughout 2022-2025 has been willing to buy Russian energy at discounts despite Western pressure, calculating that energy security and economic development matter more than geopolitical alignment. Now let me show you what European alternatives to Russian gas actually cost. LNG imports have been Europe's primary replacement for Russian pipeline gas. Europe throughout 2022-2025 increased LNG imports from approximately 80 billion cubic meters in 2021 to approximately 150+ billion cubic meters by 2024-2025. This LNG comes primarily from United States, Qatar, Algeria, and other global suppliers. But LNG is inherently more expensive than pipeline gas because it requires liquefaction, specialized tankers, regasification, and operates on global markets where prices fluctuate based on Asian demand. Throughout 2024-2025, European LNG prices are typically $100, $200 per thousand cubic meters higher than pipeline gas would cost at similar supply-demand conditions. Over 150 billion cubic meters, this represents $15 to $30 billion annually in additional costs compared to pipeline gas. Norwegian pipeline gas has been Europe's second major replacement source. Norway, throughout 2022-2025, maximized production, increasing from approximately 120 billion cubic meters annually to 125 plus billion cubic meters. But Norwegian production is near maximum sustainable levels and can't increase much further without massive new investments taking 5 to 10 years. Norwegian gas throughout 2024-2025 provides stability but not growth in European supply. And Norway sells at market prices, meaning European consumers pay elevated costs even for Norwegian gas because market prices are set by marginal LNG imports. Infrastructure costs throughout 2022-2025 have been enormous. Europe built approximately 20 plus new LNG import terminals at costs of hundreds of millions to over €1 billion each. Total infrastructure spending throughout 2022-2025 on LNG terminals, pipeline connections, and storage facilities has been tens of billions of euros. These infrastructure costs are permanent investments that provide long-term value by diversifying European gas sources. But they represent costs that wouldn't have been necessary if Russian gas had continued flowing, and they need to be amortized over decades of use. Let me tell you what this reveals about sanctions strategy effectiveness. Economic sanctions are supposed to change adversary behavior by inflicting costs that adversary cannot bear, forcing adversary to modify policies to get sanctions relief. Russia throughout 2022-2025 has adapted to gas sanctions by redirecting exports to alternative markets and maintaining revenue levels comparable to pre-sanctions period. This means gas sanctions throughout 2022-2025 have not inflicted unbearable costs on Russia. Russia is paying some costs, having to give discounts to Asian customers, investing in alternative infrastructure, losing European market that was reliable for decades. But these costs throughout 2024-2025 have not prevented Russia from funding war effort or forced Russia to seek sanctions relief through policy changes. European sanctions plan throughout 2022-2025 was based on assumption that losing European gas market would cripple Russian revenues because Europe was such dominant customer. This assumption throughout 2024-2025 has proven false. Russia can earn comparable revenues from Asian markets, and global gas market is flexible enough that Russia can redirect enormous volumes relatively quickly. The strategic failure throughout 2022-2025 is that Europe inflicted enormous costs on itself through lost access to cheap Russian gas while not inflicting comparable costs on Russia because Russia found alternative customers. This is worst possible outcome for sanctions: maximum pain for sanctioning country, minimal pain for sanctioned country. Now let me explain what happens going forward into 2026-2030. Russian gas revenues throughout 2026-2030 will likely continue at 60-80 billion annually, or potentially higher as Asian demand grows and as Power of Siberia 2 comes online, bringing another 50 billion cubic meters of capacity. Russia by 2030 could be exporting 100 plus billion cubic meters annually to China, plus 30-40 billion cubic meters of LNG globally, plus smaller amounts to other customers, potentially earning $70-90 billion annually depending on prices. This would exceed pre-war revenue levels, meaning sanctions will have completely failed to reduce Russian gas income long term. Europe throughout 2026-2030 will complete infrastructure to eliminate remaining Russian gas dependence, reducing imports from current 15-20 billion cubic meters to essentially zero. But European gas will remain permanently more expensive than pre-war period, costing European competitiveness and living standards. The final accounting throughout 2026-2030 will show that Europe successfully reduced its own Russian dependence at cost of hundreds of billions in higher energy costs and lost industrial capacity, while Russia successfully pivoted to Asian markets and sustained revenues at comparable or higher levels than pre-war. Europe achieved its secondary goal, independence, but failed its primary goal, crippling Russian revenues. Let me tell you what I personally think this teaches about economic warfare. Sanctions against major resource exporting country with alternative customers are much less effective than sanctions against smaller countries without alternatives. Russia had bad luck that Ukraine war started just as China relationship was deepening and infrastructure to supply China was completing. This timing throughout 2022-2025 allowed Russia to pivot quickly. If Ukraine war had happened in 2015 before Power of Siberia existed, Russian gas sanctions might have been devastating because no alternative market existed at scale. But in 2022, China was ready, willing, and able to absorb massive volumes of Russian gas that Europe didn't want. This transformed sanctions from potentially crippling to merely inconvenient for Russia. Europe throughout 2022-2025 designed sanctions assuming Russia couldn't quickly replace European market. This assumption proved fatally wrong. Russia throughout 2022-2025 demonstrated remarkable adaptability in redirecting trade flows, accepting discounts, building infrastructure, and maintaining revenues despite losing largest customer. Russia's gas revenues hit record high in 2024 at approximately $63-70 billion, matching or exceeding pre-war levels of $60-70 billion despite losing 90% of European market. Europe throughout 2024-2025 has quietly admitted sanctions plan failed through shift in rhetoric from triumph to acknowledging sanctions are long-term pressure rather than immediate constraint. The admission is implicit through policy shifts and change messaging rather than explicit acknowledgement. But throughout 2024-2025, European officials and analysts have clearly recognized that Russian gas revenues were not crushed and that Russia adapted successfully to sanctions. As 2025 ends, Russia sustains gas revenues through Asian markets, particularly China, while Europe faces permanently higher energy costs and lost industrial capacity from replacing Russian gas with expensive alternatives. Strategic balance shows Europe achieved energy independence from Russia, but at enormous cost while failing to achieve primary objective of crippling Russian revenues. The revenues are at record levels, the sanctions plan failed, and the quiet admission throughout 2024-2025 reveals that economic warfare against major resource exporter with alternative customers is far less effective than Western policymakers believed when designing sanctions that ultimately hurt Europe economically more than they hurt Russia strategically.